Welcome, everybody, to the Cone of Shame Veterinary Podcast. I am your host, DrAndyRoark. Guys, I am here with my friend, Dr. Lance Roasa, who is a practicing lawyer. He is a DVM. He is also the principal attorney and founder at the Roasa Law Group, which is a law group that only works with veterinarians. So we talk about that and what that's like. But I've got a couple of lawsuits that I'm seeing that I just want to understand a bit better. And there's really two of them today that I want to talk about. The first one is LMU Lincoln Memorial University suing the AVMA and what that is about. And then the second one is veterinary interns launching a class action lawsuit against the match program and some of the vet schools. And so anyway, those are the two lawsuits that I'm seeing. I'm kind of like, I don't know exactly what to make of these. And so Lance is going to come in. He breaks both of those cases down and just talks about why they're happening, what the argument is, what seems valid and what seems kind of shaky. And I will tell you, in both cases, I leave the episode feeling a bit differently than I did going in, and with a much deeper understanding of the nuances of what's happening here. So anyway, I do love talking to Lance. I push him a little bit. I start to talk to him about what's driving these lawsuits. You know, we argue a little bit about good old boy networks and venture capitalists and all of those sorts of things. And I think Lance has got a nice, healthy view about what's probably going on. And I don't think it's an overall sweeping conspiracy. I think every case is a little bit different and it's happening for slightly different reasons. And so anyway, really great episode and insight into what's going on in our profession right now. Let's get into it.
This is your show. We're glad you're here. We want to help you in your veterinary career. Welcome to the Cone of Shame with Dr. Andy Roark.
Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lance Roasa. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, Dr. Roark. How are you today?
Man, I'm doing great. It is so good to have you back on the podcast. You know, I had you on a number of times before. I always appreciate talking with you. You, for those who don't know, have such an interesting background. You are a veterinarian. You have a DVM. You are also a lawyer. You have a JD. You have been a practice owner. You have also owned an enormous cattle ranch until fairly recently. And now you are the principal attorney and founder at Roasa Law Group, and you do exclusively law and you do exclusively veterinary law. So tell me real quick, what are the types of services that you end up spending most of your time on?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks for having me on. I always really enjoy visiting with you and talking with you. Yeah, so we do only veterinary law. So we practice 100% for veterinarians. And we've got, several associate attorneys and, paralegals and like that do a great job. But about half of what we do, 30 to 40 to 50% of what we do are people getting into contracts. So we help them with their contract as they're entering in. There's another 30 or 40% where we help people getting out of contracts where they're either were terminated or they've got to put in notice, and there's usually some sort of extenuating circumstances relating to employment law. And then the last, we help veterinarians buy and sell veterinary practices. That's my training, actually. I'm a transactional attorney, work in mergers and acquisitions. And so I love helping veterinarians buy practices, and I love veterinarians help them sell their practices as a former practice owner myself. So that's the brunt of what we do.
I've talked to you many times about contracts for veterinarians. We talk about non-compete contracts and clauses and things like that. And so I had you in a number of times. What I want to talk to you about today is something that I really kind of want to get my head around. And I kind of want to understand, what is this and how seriously should I take this and what does this mean? LMU, Lincoln Memorial University, has sued the AVMA and the Council of Education for anti-competitive practices. And I'm just going to stop there and hand this to you and say, Lance, what does that mean exactly? What have they sued for here?
Yeah, well, actually, Andy, this is your question about how seriously should we take this. I'll tell you, when I opened my news that morning, my jaw dropped. I mean, I actually gasped that a constituent school would be suing the governing body. But after digging into it and reading the plaintiff's complaint and studying it and things like that, it's really a pretty straightforward lawsuit alleging that the AVMA, through the Council on Education, is engaging in antitrust or Sherman antitrust activities. And so, said of like a very simplistic way, engaging in protectionist activities by limiting the number of schools that are in the United States, it limits the number of veterinarians that are in the United States, and thus creates essentially a monopoly on veterinary services. It's not truly a monopoly, because everybody's providing different services, but with lower numbers of veterinarians and more people needing veterinary services, it drives the price up. And so the lawsuit is alleging that this is done on purpose, it's done systematically, and it's done this accreditation process is done in an arbitrary fashion. And we can, we'll probably talk about that in a few minutes as well.
That's what they say. What does the AVMA say? Surely they've responded to this, at least superficially.
Well, they haven't, on the surface yet. And so we don't exactly know how they're going to respond and how they're going to, defend the lawsuit. I'm sure that at some point, and I'm, kind of reading between the lines here, the AVMA, through multiple economic papers and things along those lines, is saying there's not really a shortage of veterinarians. And so that's kind of the heart of this whole debate is where do we stand in the number of veterinarians in this country? We've got economic models and we've got economic reports that basically point in both directions. I think the AVMA is going to probably say something to the lines of, there's not really a shortage on veterinarians. There's not really a conspiracy here, to reduce the number of veterinarians in the country. And there's not, subsequently, antitrust issues.
That makes sense to me. So when we look at LMU, is it interesting to you that LMU was the group that brought this?
Actually, no. So after digging into this, the LMU Law School sued the American Bar Association 10 or 12 years ago when they were undergoing their accreditation status. And so the American Bar Association acts much like the AVMA's COE to accredit law schools, so does site visits and studies the curriculum and things like that. And so the same school sued the ABA, their own accreditor, and ultimately lawsuit really looked along very similar lines. It wasn't a copy and paste job, but it had very similar complaints. Ultimately, they ended up dropping that lawsuit, and very shortly thereafter, they were accredited. The law school was accredited by the ABA. And so, as far as which school chose to bring the lawsuit, well, they've had a history of doing this at LMU in the past. And secondly, LMU is the United States' largest veterinary school. They graduated class of about 225 veterinarians a year. And they're thinking about, or actually doing, adding a Florida campus as well. And so that would almost double their class size. But there's about 150 students that are going to attend down in Florida. So they would be not just a little bit of the largest veterinary school. That would be the largest veterinary school in the contiguous 48 states by a long shot.
If LMU were to be successful with their lawsuit, right? And so they sue the AVMA and they said there's just sort of anti-competitive practices. You're restricting the ability of people to make veterinary schools, and because you restrict this ability to create vet schools, there's essentially a monopoly. There's the schools that are in existence, and no one else is able to compete with them. If LMU is successful in their lawsuit, Lance, does that mean the doors are kind of wide open for people to start making vet schools? In all of I'm actually, they're going to be like Halloween spirit shops, the ones that pop up, just a Rite Aid goes out of business and then bam, it's a vet school. Is that what we're going to go to?
There's actually 13 planned veterinary schools in the country right now. So as far as are the doors being blown off of it, that's relatively speaking, that's a lot of new vet schools.
Well, we had 33, and then there's 15 more that are, 13 or 15 more that are coming. You go, that's a pretty substantial percentage, 33 to 40%, increase in vet schools over a period of a couple of years. That's pretty significant upward movement.
Yeah, really. Actually, it's in a lawsuit, but, we both know because we've been in this industry for a long time. The number of veterinary schools has been relatively stable, through the 60s and 70s and 80s. There's been a sprinkling of new schools, but not a wave of 15 and 20 new schools in just the matter of a decade, but the lawsuit is not necessarily, they're not necessarily suing to allow new schools. What the specifics of the lawsuit are is they're just asking the AVMA through injunctive relief, which just means that the court can force the AVMA COE to do certain things. But they're looking for injunctive relief to apply the standards. The AVMA COE has a series of standards that they accredit veterinary schools to, but they want them to apply those standards in a non-arbitrary fashion. They want to have more concrete and thoughtful points that the AVMA can apply. And so as far as, is this going to open the floodgates? Not necessarily so, but it could if there's a much more of a checklist style, set of standards for the COE to follow.
I read that sort of the point of contention with LMU specifically, right? So they're opening up this Orlando campus. And it seemed to me like the point of contention was something around there's a point of order that's around research volume. Yeah. Tell me about that. What does that mean?
That's actually, it's accreditation standard 10, that they're specifically pointing to. And this is actually and how all this came about is you look back to September and October of 2024, the COE basically downgraded LMU's main campus's accreditation status. They put them on probation with a major deficiency. That's a big deal, right? And we're not talking about a minor issue. It was a major deficiency, and that major deficiency was in research. And so what the AVMA COE is basically saying is you don't have enough research clinicians, you don't have enough research academicians. The students that you're graduating with a veterinary degree don't have enough exposure and access to adequate research programs. Now, here's the kicker. For the previous 10 years, roughly, the AVMA had not had issues with LMU's research. They accredited them and reaccredited them multiple times without saying anything about their lack of research or lack of research faculty. And then all of a sudden, here comes September, October 2024, not just a warning, but a major downgrade on the probationary status, which, don't hold me to this, but the school has generally 2 or 3 years to basically rectify that situation, or they risk losing their accreditation status.
What do you think is most interesting about all of this? When you look at it and how it's sort of shaping up, what draws your attention and what kind of makes you think?
Yeah, I can tell you personally, when I read these lawsuits and even the lawsuit about veterinary interns, and when I look at, the amount of private equity dollars that are flowing into this industry, my mind goes immediately to veterinary medicine is not a backwater, small beans profession anymore. I mean, we are facing big time growing pains. We're facing, the same things that, our human colleagues have faced over the years. And, and we're not, just the little brother, to the human physician or human medical world. I mean, veterinary medicine is a big deal with a lot of dollars flowing through these educational campuses. Yeah. These schools, maybe not for profit, but they certainly create a lot of revenue. There's a lot of money that's spent in veterinary education. The veterinary industry as a whole is growing rapidly. I think that we're in the $60 to $70 billion range at this point, as a whole in this country. It employs 500,000 plus people, overall. So, the veterinary industry, the thing that makes me stop and think is when I got into the veterinary industry in the late 90s, it was kind of a small beans deal. And it's not a small beans deal, we're talking, just 25 years later.
Talk to me a bit about the veterinary interns suing their universities and sort of internship providers a bit. What's your perspective on that lawsuit?
The main defendant on that lawsuit is the match program, the VIRMP. So the body that matches those things together. Yeah, there are a lot of co-defendants, where we're talking about, internship providers, some schools, some private hospitals, independent hospitals as well. So what we have in that lawsuit are a couple of veterinarians that had undergone internships recently, like in, the last 4 or 5 years or so. And it's kind of interesting, Andy, because their lawsuits are alleging many of the same things that the LMU lawsuit we just got through, talking about, looking at antitrust and conspiracy and basically price fixing on salaries. And so what they're saying is the schools and the match program is basically acting to show everybody's salary. And these providers of internships are conspiring to keep salaries low. Right. And, and again, that it's the same law or the same set of laws that we're talking about, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so as a whole, what it's saying is veterinary internship salaries are kept low artificially because of the allegedly illegal activities of these providers.
That seems hard to prove, right? So usually when we talk about wage transparency or, sharing salaries publicly, it's seen as a positive thing, right? Like we want to make it transparent what people are getting paid so that we can say, things are equitable and they're fair and people know what they're getting into. But it sounds like what you're saying is looking at the match. If you are a provider of internships and you're using the match, then you can look at those salaries and say, oh, there's no upward pressure as long as we all kind of keep our salaries down low, we can continue to have work at this low pay rate. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, really kind of sets a difference between historical salaries and present and future or prospective salaries. And so, if we all got together and say, last year, a few years ago, this is how much we made, and therefore this is how much we paid our employees, that's kind of a historical thing. It's attenuated. There's some distance there, right? But the match in particular, on its face, de facto, when you are going through and looking at those various internship locations, you can see for public knowledge what the prospective compensation is going to be. And so that's the difference. And so it's historical versus looking forward. And so, in any of the other providers, any of the other internship providers can go and look at that data as well, not what they paid in the past, but what they're going to pay in the future. And that's really key to the key differentiator when we're talking about Sherman antitrust lawsuits.
So when you're looking at these two lawsuits, right? So you're looking at the LMU and then you're looking at the interns. Do you have a feeling about which way the wind is blowing from a legal decision sort of standpoint? Do you feel like we're entering into a time when we're going to find support for reducing sort of these restrictive type infrastructures? Or do you think we are heading into a place where those sort of, I don't want to call them restrictive, but those almost like gatekeeper sort of structures where they're going to sort of be protected? Do you have an instinct on, are there overall trends there?
I do. I mean, this is completely a gut feeling, Andy, but, I see kind of that old guard, that kind of protectionist thinking, some people refer to it, colloquially as the good old boys club is breaking down of sorts. And that's what's happening is these lawsuits are, kind of chipping away at those institutions that have basically brought our profession to where it's at now. So, and I kind of like what I think is kind of, juxtaposed against all of that is consumer demand, right? So we have consumers that are in our services as veterinarians are in high demand, and that's kind of, and we haven't even discussed this yet, Andy, but, we can talk about the veterinary practitioners, over in Colorado. Right. And so the consumers have spoken and said, we want more access to veterinary care. And so both of these lawsuits in a kind of a circuitous way are saying, hey, we need more veterinarians in this country. There's not necessarily a shortage in veterinarians. So my gut is telling me that lawyers, we can always blame it on the lawyer, right, Andy? The lawyers are going to chip away, at these things through various methods. And, and these lawsuits, in my opinion, have some merit, right? I mean, these are not frivolous lawsuits. There are some real claims here. The internship lawsuit is actually a class action lawsuit, which could have 5,000 different plaintiffs. So anybody that's done an internship and suffered through the hours and suffered through the low salary could actually join this lawsuit. So we could see a relatively large number of veterinarians join that lawsuit if the court allows and certifies all of the class action stuff.
I guess I'm curious as your perspective here. So you've been a veterinarian, you've been a practice owner, you sort of the veterinary culture and everything. And you also mentioned, private equity money and the amount of money that's sort of coming in to the profession. And maybe I think I'm about to ask you a question on morality here, so I apologize for that. But when you look at this and you see lawsuits like this, and you mentioned, you sort of said the good old boys network, and you talk about this sort of being chiseled away. Do you really see it, Lance, as like the good old boys network is being broken down to provide better access? Or do you see it as the private equity guys are coming in and there's money to be made? And so there's sort of the rampant capitalists are like, let's break this down and make as much money for ourselves as we possibly can. Or do you see something in between?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to be very, forthright here is I don't see the fingerprints of the private equity groups on these lawsuits. I don't see them in the background, hiding in the shadows saying, go file this lawsuit. In fact, the internship lawsuit would damage them greatly, right? They would have to pay their interns more if successful. And some of the biggest plaintiffs in this are, MedVet and Mars and some large veterinary consolidators and large veterinary, owned groups. On the Lincoln Memorial suit, I mean, there's definitely money behind Lincoln Memorial. They're a not-for-profit institution, but I don't see the consolidators or the private equity groups urging Lincoln Memorial to do this. Now, would they benefit from it? Well, veterinary salaries in theory, if more veterinary schools were allowed, veterinary salaries in theory would go down. It doesn't stand, to reason much there. Now, would that actually happen in real life? I'm not an economist, Andy. But my knee-jerk reaction as a practicing veterinarian is there's still a lot of work for all of us.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate you saying that and sort of laying those things out. It's interesting. I think that there are some clashing worldviews that are out there about veterinarians holding on to control and not sharing control. And then there's other worldviews of everything is secret capitalist, objectives to tear away the safeguards and make as much money as possible without thought of long-term consequences. And I don't know that either. I don't think either of those worldviews is true and accurate across the board. Whenever I see things like this, and both of these lawsuits we're talking about, they do feel sort of similar, but you're right, it is different in sort of who benefits and who is damaged in both of them.
Yeah, and I mean, and I want to be clear, I don't think the AVMA has sat around, and I don't know this, at all, and conspired. That's the exact words, conspired that this is what we're going to do so we can all make more money. We're going to limit the number of veterinarians on the board of directors and through the Council on Education. I don't think that happened. My gut tells me that didn't happen. I know people that were on those boards and those councils, and I know that they wouldn't do that. I think that the meaning was probably, we need to protect our patients and protect our clients and thus train veterinarians appropriately and properly and make sure that we have the right schools, accredited. I to me as a veterinarian, and this is, I think, where you and I and the rest of the profession kind of differ from the private equity world, is my first thought always goes to patient health. What's it going to do to patient health? What's it going to do to the client that's standing in front of me right now? What's it going to do to the price that they have to pay for, the service that I'm about to provide? What's it going to cost if they have to go to the emergency center for the overnight, right? That's where my heart and my mind goes to, not, hey, how is somebody going to make more money? But on the other end of that spectrum, somebody's sitting there thinking, how are we going to make or lose money on this situation?
That's fantastic. Lance, thank you so much for talking through this with me. Where can people find you online? Where can they learn more about the Roasa Law Group?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, it's just roasalaw.com. That's ROASA. Interestingly enough, way behind you, we did start a podcast just a few months ago where we take deep dives into these exact legal issues. I know you talk about all sorts of stuff. I only talk about, legal stuff. So if listeners do have a stronger interest in learning more about non-competes or learning about what are the things that I need to think about when I'm selling my practice or buying a practice, we talk through those things. And so I'd love to have folks join us over there. Some of the most timely topics that we've had are, AI and what's AI going to do, in veterinary medicine. What's Proposition 129 going to do in Colorado, for veterinary medicine? Is this going to spread across the country? These are phenomenally interesting things to talk about. Hopefully people find them interesting as well.
What's the name of the podcast?
It's called The Office Hours.
Outstanding. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes so everybody can find that. Lance, thanks again for being here. Thanks for tuning in and listening, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks, Andy. Have a good one.
And that's what I got. Guys, thanks for being here. Thanks to Lance Roasa of the Roasa Law Group. Guys, I really appreciate your time. I hope you learned something here. I'll see you guys later on.